The morning my son-in-law asked me to drop off his laptop at the repair shop, I thought nothing of it. He said the screen was glitching, said he needed it back by Thursday for a work presentation. I told him sure, no problem. I passed right by Henderson's Tech on my way to the pharmacy anyway. That was the kind of man I was. The kind who says sure, no problem. The kind who drives his daughter's husband's laptop across town without thinking twice about it. I should have thought twice. My name is Arthur. No, wait, let me back up. That's not where this story starts. This story starts 6 years earlier, when my daughter Vera brought home a man named Fletcher Cole and introduced him as the one. She was 32. I was 61. Her mother had passed 2 years before that, breast cancer, quick and cruel, and Vera and I had spent those 2 years leaning on each other so hard we'd practically fused. When she brought Fletcher home for Thanksgiving, I remember thinking, finally, she's happy again. He shook my hand firm, looked me in the eye, said, "Sir, I want you to know I'll take care of her." I believed him. God help me, I believed him. Fletcher was in commercial real estate. Did well enough, or so he said. He wore good shoes, drove a clean truck, talked about the market the way men do when they want you to think they understand things. Vera worked as an occupational therapist, the kind of quiet, steady work she'd always been drawn to. They got married in the backyard of my house in Asheville, North Carolina, on a Saturday in October. 92 guests, string lights in the oak trees. My granddaughter from my sister's side scattered rose petals down the aisle. I gave a toast and cried and wasn't embarrassed about it at all. I live alone now in that same house. 3 bedrooms I don't need. A kitchen my wife used to fill with smells that don't live there anymore. I'm 67. I have my pension from 31 years at the County Water Authority. A modest 401(ang), a savings account I built carefully for decades, and a life insurance policy I took out in my 50s that lists Vera as the sole beneficiary. She's my only child. Of course it's her. It was always her. Fletcher knew about all of it. Vera must have told him. Couples talk about those things. That's normal. I never thought to worry about it. The laptop drop-off was a Tuesday in March. I remember because there was still frost on the windshield when I went out at 7:30 in the morning. I scraped it off with the old ice scraper I keep in the back seat, the one with the red foam handle that's been there since 2009. I picked up the laptop bag from their porch. Vera was already at work. Fletcher had an early meeting. They'd left it out for me, and I drove to Henderson's. Curtis Henderson has been fixing computers and phones in this town for about 15 years. We're not close friends, but we went to the same church for a while when his kids were young, and I've taken things to him before. Printer trouble, cracked phone screen, things like that. He's a quiet man, methodical, not a talker. Which is why when I came back to pick up the laptop 2 days later, and he came out from the back room with a look on his face that I can only describe as careful, I noticed immediately. He asked me to come in, closed the door behind us. That door is usually propped open. He said, "Art, I need to ask you something before we go any further." I said, "Okay." He said, "Is this laptop yours?" I told him no, it was my son-in-law's. He asked his name. I told him Fletcher Cole. Curtis nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. Then he turned the screen toward me. He said, "I wasn't snooping." I opened the browser to check the operating system version, and this is what was already there, open in the background. There were 2 tabs. The first one was a life insurance calculator, the kind where you plug in a policy number and a beneficiary, and it estimates payout values based on different scenarios. The policy number on the screen was mine. I recognized it because I had stared at that number enough times over the years that it had lodged itself somewhere in my brain the way phone numbers used to before cell phones. My policy, my number. The second tab was an email draft, not sent, saved as a draft dated 6 weeks earlier. It was addressed to someone named R. Cole, Fletcher's brother, who I had met exactly twice at family events, and who I knew worked in some kind of finance. The email said, in plain language that left very little room for interpretation, "The timeline is moving. He's in good health, but the doctor said his blood pressure has been elevated. We need to move on the account transfers before the quarter closes. V doesn't know, and she won't." I stood there in Curtis's shop for a long moment and didn't say anything. Curtis said, "I'm not telling you what to think, but if I were you, I'd go to the bank and I'd call a lawyer. Today, not tomorrow." I drove home. I don't remember the drive. I sat in my driveway for a while, with the engine off and the heat ticking as it cooled. And I thought about Vera at our Thanksgiving table 6 years ago, watching Fletcher shake my hand, smiling the way she hadn't smiled in 2 years. And I thought about her mother, who would have known. Miriam always knew. She had a way of reading people that I never had. I thought about the email. V doesn't know, and she won't. Whatever Fletcher was planning, he had made sure to keep Vera out of it. Whether that was because he was protecting her or using her, I didn't yet know. That distinction would matter a great deal later. I did what Curtis told me to do. I called my bank, First National in Asheville, and asked to speak to a branch manager. I didn't explain everything over the phone, but I said I had concerns about account security and wanted to come in. They made me an appointment for that afternoon. Then I called my attorney, a man named Douglas Fitch, who handled my wife's estate and who I'd stayed in touch with since. I got his voicemail. I left a message that said it was important and asked him to call me back that day. At the bank, I sat across from a woman named Sandra, who had been a manager there for years and who recognized me from the branch where I'd banked since 1991. I told her what I'd seen. She pulled up my accounts. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mr. Leland, about 3 weeks ago, we received a request to add an authorized user to your savings account. The request came with what appeared to be a signed authorization form." She turned the screen toward me. The signature looked like mine. It wasn't mine. The authorized user was Fletcher Cole. He had not yet moved any money. Sandra wasn't sure if he was waiting, watching, or whether the forged authorization had been flagged somewhere in the process and stalled. But the access was there, pending, like a key made in secret, waiting to be used. Sandra froze the account pending investigation. She was professional about it, calm. But I saw the way she looked at me, and it was the same way Curtis had looked at me in the shop. That particular human expression that people wear when they have to deliver information that changes someone's world, and they know it. I drove home and Douglas called me back at 6:15. I told him everything. He was quiet in that lawyer way he had, the way where you know he's not being dismissive, he's just thinking. Then he said, "Don't touch anything yet. Don't confront Fletcher. Don't tell Vera. I know that sounds wrong, but let me explain." He explained that if Fletcher was aware I knew, he might move quickly to cover his tracks, and that we needed to document everything properly before any confrontation happened. He said to write down everything I remembered, dates, the email content as closely as I could recall it, the policy number, what Curtis had told me and when. He said he would contact a colleague who handled financial fraud cases, and they would talk first thing in the morning. That night I made myself eat dinner. Scrambled eggs and toast, the same thing I've been making for a quick meal since I was 25. I sat at the kitchen table where Vera had done her homework as a kid, where Miriam and I had paid bills together, where we'd played cards on winter nights, and I ate my eggs, and I thought about how a man could sit across from you at that same table, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and look you in the eye, year after year, while building something like this quietly in the background. The word that kept coming to me was patient. Not angry, not panicked, just patient. Like Fletcher had simply decided at some point that I was an obstacle between him and a certain amount of money, and that the smart play was to wait. That patience made it worse, somehow. I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what Douglas and his colleague, a fraud attorney named Weston Park, told me to do. I went back to Curtis, and he made a formal statement about what he had seen on the laptop, including photographs of the screen. Weston contacted the insurance company and flagged my policy for a security hold. Douglas had a forensic accountant review my financial records going back 3 years, looking for anything I might have missed. The forged authorization at the bank was sent to a documents examiner, and I kept showing up to Sunday dinners at Vera and Fletcher's house, eating food I was afraid to touch. That last part, I have to be honest about it. Every time Fletcher put something on the table, some part of my brain went somewhere cold and dark. I didn't eat much. I said I'd been having stomach trouble, which was not entirely a lie. I watched him pour wine, and I watched him pass the bread, and I watched Vera look at him the way she did, still with that same love she'd had on their wedding day, and I said nothing. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, harder than sitting with Miriam in the hospital, harder than closing her estate. At least in grief, there's nothing to pretend about. Weston reached out to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office in the 4th week. By that point, they had the documents examiner's report on the forged signature, Fletcher's browser history from Curtis's recovery of the laptop's cache, the email draft, and a recorded phone call, obtained legally, I want to be clear, between Fletcher and his brother R. Cole, in which the two of them discussed the Leland situation, in terms that any reasonable person would find difficult to interpret as anything other than fraud, and, at certain points in the conversation, something considerably darker. R. Cole asked, in this call, whether there was any way to accelerate the timeline. Fletcher said he was working on it. The sheriff's deputies went to their house on a Wednesday morning. I know this because I was parked down the street, which Douglas had told me not to do, and I did it anyway. I watched from a distance. I'm 67 years old, and I had spent 4 weeks eating scrambled eggs alone and pretending to be a man who suspected nothing, and I needed to see it with my own eyes. They brought Fletcher out in handcuffs at 10:40 in the morning. He was still in his work clothes, dark slacks, blue button-down. He didn't look violent desperate, the way you might expect. He looked like a man who had known this was coming and had decided to be composed about it. I don't know if that made it better or worse. Vera called me 45 minutes later. I could hear from her voice that she'd been crying and had then gone somewhere past crying, into that numb state on the other side. She said, Dad, I need you to tell me this isn't what they're saying it is. I drove to her. I sat with her in her living room for 4 hours. I told her everything, not the way I'd rehearsed it, because all of that left my head the moment I saw her face, but the real version, starting with the laptop and Curtis's expression and the 2 open tabs on the screen, and ending with the phone call, the signature, the accounts. She listened without interrupting, which wasn't like her. Vera is a talker, an asker of questions. She sat very still, with her hands folded in her lap, and I watched her absorb it all, layer by layer. At one point she said, he told you he'd take care of me. I said, I know. She said, he said that to your face. I said, I know. She asked about R. Cole, Fletcher's brother. Weston had already looked into him. His role appeared to be advisory. He had helped Fletcher understand how the account authorization process worked, and there was enough in the recorded call to charge him as a co-conspirator. He was arrested the same morning as Fletcher, at his home in Charlotte. Fletcher was charged with forgery, financial fraud, and criminal solicitation. The solicitation charge was the most serious. Accelerating the timeline was what the prosecutors were focused on. It was what I tried not to think about too much, at night, alone in my house. The case took 11 months to go to trial. 11 months of Vera rebuilding a life that had been built on something false, of me watching her do it with the kind of quiet determination that reminded me so much of her mother. It sometimes caught me off guard in the middle of ordinary moments. 11 months of pretrial hearings and depositions, and one afternoon where I sat in a conference room and gave a formal statement about everything I'd seen and done, and Douglas sat next to me, and I told the whole thing from the beginning again. The laptop, the frost on the windshield, the ice scraper with the red foam handle. The trial itself lasted 6 days. I testified on the second day. I was not nervous. I had been nervous about plenty of things in my life. Getting married, the first day of a new job, Miriam's surgery. But I was not nervous about this. I sat in that chair, and I answered every question as clearly and carefully as I could. And when Fletcher's attorney tried to suggest that I had overreacted to an innocent browser history and a misunderstanding about the account authorization, I looked at the jury and as I said, plainly, that a man does not forge his father-in-law's signature by accident. On the 4th day, Fletcher took the stand. I was not expecting that. His attorney must have thought it would help. It didn't. He spoke for about an hour. He talked about feeling like an outsider in the family, always the son-in-law and never the son. He talked about financial pressures I hadn't known about, bad investments, debts. He talked about Vera, as though she were a piece of furniture in the house he was trying to secure. I sat in the gallery and listened to him explain himself, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was pity, not the kind that forgives, the kind that just recognizes how small a person can become when they choose money over everything else. The jury deliberated for 2 days, guilty on all counts. Fletcher received 7 years. R. Cole received 4 with the possibility of parole. The insurance company sent me a letter formally confirming that the security hold had protected my policy and that the case would be entered into their fraud prevention records. First National sent me a notice that the fraudulent authorization had been expunged from my file. Douglas called me after the sentencing and said, "You did everything right." I thanked him and meant it. That evening I drove out to Riverside Cemetery, where Miriam is buried under an oak tree that drops acorns in October and makes a tremendous noise on her headstone, which I have never asked anyone to trim because I think she would have found it funny. I sat on the bench nearby and I talked to her for a while the way I do sometimes. I told her about Fletcher start to finish. I told her about Curtis in the shop with his careful expression. I told her about Vera, the way she had sat still with her hands folded and absorbed everything I told her without flinching, the same way she'd held herself together after her mother died. I told Miriam that her daughter was going to be all right. I don't know what I believe about what happens after a person dies. I've never been certain. But sitting there in the evening with the oak tree dropping its noise on the headstone, I felt something that I'm not going to argue with. Vera filed for divorce in December. She kept the house, which was in her name, as her attorney had structured things before the arrest. She's been going to therapy. She called me last week to say she'd started running again, which she used to do in college, and that she'd done 3 miles without stopping. I told her that was good. She said, "Dad, I just want you to know, if you hadn't taken that laptop in that morning." I told her it was Curtis she should thank. She said, "I'm thanking you." I let her. She's my daughter. Some things a father just accepts. My savings account is secure. My policy is secure. My house is the same house it has always been, with the kitchen that Miriam filled, and the oak tree out back, and the bedroom that has too much space in it since she left. I am 67 years old and I have learned, later than I would have liked, that love is not protection, that a man can smile at your table for 6 years and call you family and be building something terrible in the background the whole time. But I have also learned this. A town where people know each other, where a repair shop owner will close his door and turn a screenshot toward you and say, "I think you should know, that is not nothing. That is not a small thing at all. I will take my car to any mechanic, my laptop to any shop, and I will never again think of it as a simple errand."